Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Arsenio Vieira. I'm here today to speak to you all about my presentation, and I have my PowerPoint right here behind me. It's called Climate Change, Causes, Effects, and Solutions. It's going to speak up a little bit about climate change and obviously the causes and the effects it has on the planet and the solutions we can implement to help slow down or even stop this climate change. So with all that being said, let's jump right into the first slide, which is titled, What is Climate Change? Now, climate change, put simply, is the change of average weather conditions over time. So, when you think of average weather conditions, think of the temperature, the rainfall, the acidity of the water or of the rain, or even how often or how severe floods happen in a certain region. Climate change is not a new thing. It has happened many, many times throughout history. And some examples I like people to think about are the many ice ages the Earth has had, or periods of more heat, such as during the beginning of the formation of the Earth, where the Earth was generally a lot hotter than it is now. So climate change is not something that just started, but has been going on as long as the Earth's been around. And finally, it is not synonymous with global warming. Many people make this mistake. They see climate change and global warming, they think they're the exact same thing. But as you can tell through the names, global warming is a type of climate change where everything is becoming warmer as opposed to cooler. Now let's get into the next slide, which continues to explain climate change. And climate change essentially affects some areas or regions differently. For example, the Middle East is feeling the current climate change, which is obviously global warming, 2 times as fast as the rest of the world. So if our average temperature here in Florida goes up by 1 degree Celsius, the Middle East, it goes up by twice that. And climate change has many effects. It impacts not only us, but obviously the many plants and animals that depend on the climate and on the rainfall, and it is happening as we speak. There's a lot of talk about climate change. You hear it everywhere. You hear it in the news, you hear it in politics, you hear it in science textbooks, obviously, but there is a lot of talk about climate change and the effects it's having on not only us, but the entire world. With that being said, let's go on to the next slide, which are the effects of climate change. Now, as I stated in the first slide, climate change affects the average weather and rainfall for a region. These effects can be negative or positive. For example, when the ice age was going around and the climate change started to come back for the Earth to be warmer in most cases, that was seen as a more positive change because it allowed for more flora, more fauna to thrive in these conditions as opposed to before, where everything was more of an icy tundra. These changes impact regional flora and fauna. Like I just said, if the climate changes for the warmer, all this snow starts to thaw, a lot more animals can survive and a lot more plants can sustain themselves. And finally, it has many negative consequences, especially nowadays. Nowadays, we are experiencing a lot of global warming. The ice caps are melting. More and more regions are becoming uninhabitable because they're becoming too hot, amongst many other consequences. Let's go on to the next slide. Continuing the causes of climate change. The major cause of climate change is non-renewable energy production. When I mention this, think of coal, fossil fuels, oil, all those things we burn to get energy in any way possible. And this causes greenhouse gas emissions, which in turn powers the greenhouse effect. Now, these are not the only emissions of greenhouse gases, but they're one of the major contributors. And the greenhouse gas effect, what it is essentially when coal gets burned, for example, it releases a bunch of greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide, methane, and these greenhouse gases, when the light comes to the earth and bounces off either the water or gets absorbed and then re-emitted into the atmosphere, the higher concentration of greenhouse gases traps more of the radiation within the earth, and that raises the average temperature of the earth, obviously. So that's sort of how the greenhouse gas effects works, and that's why these greenhouse gases are essentially making the earth a lot warmer. And with all this comes the possibility of a runoff greenhouse effect, which is something that happened on the planet Venus. Venus actually has a thick atmosphere with a lot of greenhouse gases, but what happened is eventually, if enough greenhouse gases get emitted and stay in the atmosphere, they continuously bounce radiation back to the surface of the planet, and it sort of gets caught in a cycle as opposed to being able to escape back into space. So a lot of the greenhouse gases make sure that the radiation gets stuck, and this is sort of a compounding effect, and that's why it's called the runoff greenhouse effect. Now, on to the next slide with the causes of climate change continued. Deforestation is another major contributor of climate change. Deforestation causes three major problems. It causes soil erosion, greenhouse gas emission, and water cycle disruptions. These amplify the problem while reducing biodiversity, which obviously speeds up climate change. Like I said, the production of fuel, of coal, the burning of coal, oil, and other unsustainable resources aren't the only thing that increase greenhouse gas emissions. Deforestation also increases it because obviously plants taking carbon dioxide release oxygen. If we cut down all the plants, there's just excess carbon dioxide, which is a greenhouse gas, and that accelerates the greenhouse effect. And another thing that deforestation does that does not specifically affect climate change is it reduces biodiversity, which is still a major problem, but it doesn't really affect climate change in a very direct manner. Now we're going to move on to the next slide to what can be done. The two major things that we can do, they sound a little obvious, but it is reduce greenhouse gas emissions and reverse the process of deforestation. In the next slides, I'm going to go on to in more detail how we can go about accomplishing these two goals. But for now, on to the next slide, which is reversing deforestation. Now, the human population is ever growing. Most countries have a positive growth rate, meaning that a positive birth rate rather, meaning that more people are being born every day than are dying, which we need more land, which leads to deforestation because we're gonna run out of land. But some I guess solutions we can come up for this problem is instead of building outwards, we can build upwards. Like for example, in many huge cities, like in New York City, they have skyscrapers or many apartment buildings instead of a multitude of houses. This comes with other problems, of course, but it is a solution that can help us reduce the amount of space, actual land we need, while we come up with better solutions how to address deforestation. And obviously we can try, if we're going to expand out into less forested areas. That's just an obvious thing, that way we don't have to cut down as many trees. Now, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, this is a major, I guess a major problem, the single greatest major problem to climate change. And obviously the first step is reducing deforestation will help us do that. Our main goal should be focused on energy production and switching to sustainable renewable energy and moving away from non-renewable energy. And there are many ways to achieve this. So let's go on to the next slide to learn how. Energy production alternatives. Now, there are many alternatives to non-renewable resources such as coal, oil, and other things we have to burn. Many of these have their pros and cons, obviously, but we will go over two alternatives in the next couple of slides. And those two alternatives are wind power and solar power. I'm sure everyone has heard of wind energy and how it's produced. Everybody knows those massive wind turbines. I've seen them at one point or another. But there are a lot of benefits to wind energy, and I'm going to list a few of them now. The power harnessed from wind through turbines is essentially how we get the energy. The kinetic energy from the wind gets transferred to mechanical energy, helps spin the turbine round and round, and that has a motor that cranks an engine and stores energy, helps produce energy for the communities. Major benefit to wind energy is that it can be harnessed both onshore, so meaning on land, and offshore in the ocean. As you know, as many people know, there is major wind, especially around coastal areas in the ocean. So that leaves an even greater potential for offshore wind energy production, something that I guess really wouldn't be possible with many other sources of energy. Like you couldn't build a coal mining facility out in the ocean. It would have to be on land. So that's an interesting benefit that the wind energy alternative brings to the energy question. And finally, it's a very low maintenance and running cost. Wind energy is not very difficult to produce. All we have to do is build a turbine, high startup cost, but other than that, it's very easy. They usually do not break, and if they break, it's not too serious. and they can be fixed by a staff of a few people. They don't take a lot of people to run. Now, solar energy can help replace these dirty fossil fuels we've been using basically through all of human history. Individual houses can be powered by their own solar energy systems, which is a very interesting benefit of solar energy. You may or may not have seen them, but in some some rural areas, they have solar farms. They have houses with instead of the traditional roofs, they have solar panels lined up across the roof that suck in the solar energy and use that energy to power that house, which is very interesting because obviously for wind energy, you're not going to use a single turbine to power one house, but here with solar energy, you do have that option. And even on UF campus, they have some solar farms where these rows of solar panels help power a specific building or a specific two buildings in the University of Florida. So solar energy can also save households money by if you install those little solar farms on your roof, it can be an efficient way to produce energy while saving money. So, in conclusion, climate change is a real phenomenon. It's been proven by many of the leading scientists. An overwhelming majority of scientists agree that climate change is a real phenomenon. It's currently affecting our planet right now. We hear about it everywhere on the news, in science, in politics. Climate change is a hot topic, no pun intended, but it has many consequences. It can make our land less inhabitable. It can raise temperatures. It can lower temperatures. It can decrease biodiversity. It can force some species to go extinct altogether. So it has many consequences, and the consequences usually outweigh the benefits in most cases. But the good news is there are things we can do to combat against climate change. Climate change is a natural process, but as humans, we are speeding it up. And if we take steps to reverse our actions, reduce our carbon footprint, reduce the amount of greenhouse gases we emit into the atmosphere, we can help fight climate change and save our planet. So thank you everyone for sitting through my presentation today. I hope you learned something. I hope you found that interesting, and have a great night. And my last slides, I have all my sources that I used to create this PowerPoint and this speech. Thank you.